to hear him. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jim Auchmutey.
Thank you, Frank. I think this microphone's getting me pretty well. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was a reporter at the Journal-Constitution for close to 30 years. Left in 2009. Always wrote a lot about Southern history and Southern culture. Have done several stories in Albany over the years. A lot more in Americus for some reason, probably because of the Carters and Andersonville and Koinonia and Habitat and things like that. So I've certainly been in Southwest Georgia a good bit. Let me start by just saying how deeply honored I am by having been asked to come and speak here. I was starting first grade in Decatur, Georgia, when the Albany movement began in the fall of 1961. I just barely remember seeing white colored signs before they became illegal when I was a little bit older. And I was still in elementary school when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. So I obviously came to understand the movement after the fact. And I've always had the deepest admiration for the people who stood up for their rights as Americans at great personal risk in places like Albany. I'd also like to recognize somebody who's here tonight who plays an important role in my book, Deanie Dudley Fricks. Deanie? Deanie was a classmate of my main character, Greg Whitcamper, at Americus High School, and helped bring about the reconciliation that's referenced in the subtitle of the book, A Student, a Divided Town, and the Long Road to Forgiveness. She's actually on the cover of the book in a partial view of her senior portrait on the bottom row. That's Deanie right there, about 2/3 of her face at the bottom here. We would have used the entire portrait there, and actually I pushed to do that at one point, but there was a problem. This portrait came from one of her classmates' yearbooks, and she had inscribed it at the bottom of her portrait, "Love, Deanie." And considering that the subject of this book is a student who was ostracized by most of his classmates, we thought that was kind of muddling the message. So, sorry, Deanie, we only got half your face on there. Deanie has a home here in Albany. And before we go any further, please understand that I pronounce it Albany, like the city in New York. Even though I'm a native Georgian, even though I'm from Atlanta, you know, I've tried very hard over the years to pronounce it the way a lot of locals do, the Albany, but it always comes off as sounding fake, like an outsider's doing it. We've actually had an audio book done of the class of '65, and the fellow who performed it is an actor in Chicago. I have not listened to it, but they tell me that he pronounced my name correctly, that he pronounced the founder of Koinonia, Clarence Jordan's name correctly, Jordan, not Jordan. But they say that he really didn't get Albany quite right. I think he was trying to do the Albany thing, but he overcompensated so much that it sounds like it's Jack Benny or something. So, but I guess we should give him an A for effort. When I was researching and writing this book, I have to admit that I kept wandering off course. And it was because of two stories that are very much part of the narrative, but are not the main focus of it. I was fascinated by Koinonia, the Christian farming community up the road in Sumter County, and its history of dissent and courage. And I was also fascinated by the history of the civil rights movement in Southwest Georgia, which started here in Albany and soon spread to the setting of my story, Americus. If it had been up to me, the class of '65 probably would have had a lot more in it about Koinonia and about the civil rights movement, but my agent and my editor said I needed to keep a tight narrative focus, and that meant that I had to omit a lot of things that I was very interested in. So let me tell you a little bit about the book and about the main narrative and some of the connections between Koinonia and the movement in Southwest Georgia. The Class of '65 is an untold true story about race, religion, and reconciliation. It focuses on a white student who grew up at Koinonia and was persecuted for his beliefs in high school. Many years later, some of the classmates who had stood by and watched all this happen and felt very bad about not having reached out to him, tracked him down in West Virginia, where he had lived for 4 decades, and apologized to him and asked him to return to Georgia for their class reunion. The book isn't just about bad things that happened in the South half a century ago. It's also about our capacity for change and growth and the promise of redemption and reconciliation. Let me give you a little background about Koinonia. Some of y'all probably know some of this, but some of you probably don't. Koinonia was founded in 1942 by Clarence Jordan, a white Southern Baptist minister from Middle Georgia who wasn't very much like other white Southern Baptist ministers from Middle Georgia. He wanted to start a commune in the rural South where the residents could live like early Christians, which is why he came up with that name, Koinonia. It's a Greek word that means fellowship or community. He believed in communal sharing, in pacifism, and in color-blind brotherhood. Koinonia these days is best known as the place where Habitat for Humanity was born in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Some people know it because of Clarence Jordan's cotton patch translations of the New Testament into the vernacular Southern language, which was the basis for an off-Broadway musical, which a lot of you know, the Cotton Patch Gospel. Nowadays, Koinonia is viewed pretty benignly in Sumter County. There's a history marker at the farm. They tell you all about it. They have brochures about Koinonia, and they tell you all about it at the Sumter County Welcome Center in Americus. But it had a very, very different reputation in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, which is the period I focus on in the first half of the book. Many of its neighbors in Sumter County saw it as a den of communists and of race mixers. My main character, Greg Whitcamper, moved to Koinonia in 1953, about the time Jimmy and Rosalind Carter came back to Sumter County after Jimmy's father died and he left the Navy. Greg was the son of a preacher from Indiana who had been kicked out of several pastorates because he kept advising young people not to register for the draft. He was a very devoted pacifist, and this was really not very popular advice in the 1940s and early 1950s. When the Whitcampers arrived in '53, Koinonia was more or less tolerated in Sumter County. People knew about their racial beliefs, and you know, the farm really advertised it. Their main business back then was selling eggs. And they sold them in cartons that showed 2 hands clasping, one white and one black. So they advertised this belief. They didn't make any secret about it. So some people didn't approve of the way they ate and lived with black residents at the farm, and some of them didn't like the fact that they were espousing some of these views in the churches that they were attending at the time. There was one church up the road from Koinonia, Rehoboth Baptist Church, that got a little bit ticked off with them in their racial views and asked them to leave the fellowship. They kicked them out. But those things were really kind of the exception. For the first 10 or 12 years that Koinonia existed, they were more or less tolerated in Sumter County. They were looked at as odd, not like the rest of us, but they were tolerated. That all started to change not long after the Whitcampers moved to the farm in the mid-1950s. The event that changed it was Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision against segregation in public schools. It really changed the mood in the South. A lot of white people got dug in their heels, got very upset about this, and unfortunately for Koinonia, about a year or two after the Brown decision, Clarence Jordan was asked by a black minister friend of his in Atlanta to come up to Atlanta and endorse 3 black students who wanted to enter the Georgia College of Business, which is today's Georgia State University, my alma mater. Clarence went to the University of Georgia for his undergraduate degree in agriculture, and so he had standing to endorse them as people who want to get into this school. Well, by the time he got back to Atlanta, back to Americus that day, it was on the front page of the Americus Times-Recorder that a local minister wanted to desegregate the schools, the university system in the state of Georgia. And the story in the Times-Recorder even had directions of how to find Koinonia's farm in case you wanted to go out and look at them or do anything else. The vandalism started that very week. Unknown parties operating under cover of darkness cut fences on the farm, chopped down fruit trees, dumped sugar in gas tanks. Then it escalated. Koinonia operated a produce stand a few miles from the farm on US 19. First it was bombed and heavily damaged, and a few months later, in early 1957, a second bomb leveled the place. In the meantime, the GBI launched an investigation of Koinonia as a possible communist front. Businesses for miles around boycotted the farm. They couldn't buy supplies, they couldn't get equipment, they couldn't sell the eggs that had supported the community. They had to go into another business entirely, selling pecans and pecan products by mail order. Their advertising slogan for this new venture has become kind of a legendary part of the Koinonia story. Clarence had a good sense of humor. He sold these pecan products under the slogan, "Help us ship the nuts out of Georgia." Looking back, it's a miracle that no one got hurt or killed at Koinonia during the 3 or 4 years that they were being terrorized, 56, 57, 58. It could have happened. On several occasions, night riders drove by the farm and shot into the buildings. When I first visited Koinonia as a reporter with the Atlanta Constitution in 1980, you could still see bullet holes in the buildings. You could still put your finger in the holes where the bullets had pierced the buildings. It made a real impression on me. There was at least one serious attempt on Clarence Jordan's life when a sniper took aim at the room where he usually sat reading at night and fired into the window. There were other shootings. One of them involved the children. At the time of the violence, there were probably about 18 kids living at Koinonia. I'd like to read a brief passage about one night in early 1957 when Greg and some of the other kids were out playing volleyball in a volleyball court that was near a peach orchard, not too far from the road, Highway 49, that curves past the farm. Early that evening, Greg and some of the children were playing volleyball on a lighted court beside a peach orchard when they saw 2 cars creeping down the bend in the highway leading to the farm. The vehicles were so close that it looked like the first one was towing the second one. The children stopped their game to watch. It seemed odd. Maybe one of them was having mechanical trouble. Then they heard several pops in rapid succession and the sound of something pelting the branches like a blowing sleet storm. Greg caught a glimpse of the guns as they discharged from the car windows, bursts of fire flicking from their muzzles like tongues from snakes. "Hit the dirt," someone screamed, and the kids dove and scattered. Inside the house near the road where the Browns lived, another family at Koinonia, Laura had just come in from volleyball and was putting her little brothers to bed. She bent over to remove John's shoes when a crack sounded and a bullet pierced the wall inches above her head. A college student who was staying at the farm and had been sitting with the young ones yelled, "Get down, the house is going to explode." Laura corralled her brothers and the 3 of them crawled into the bathroom shower where she thought they might be safer. After the volleyball court shooting, Greg said years later, we thought they were going to take us out and hang us on crosses. That was what it was like to live at Koinonia during the terror years of the 1950s. If it sounds familiar to people at this museum, it's the same kind of thing that black people in the civil rights movement went through. It's what King and the people in Montgomery had already gone through in 1955 and 56. It's what later happened. Some of that happened in Albany. Some of it certainly happened in Americus. It happened in Selma. It happened everywhere that people were standing up for their rights. And it happened to white people who were agreeing with the people who were standing up for their rights. The violence against Koinonia eventually tailed off. It took a bombing to do it. There was a feed and seed store in downtown Americus that agreed to break the boycott and to sell them some farm supplies. Within a week of them doing that, one Saturday night after midnight, a large bomb went off in downtown Americus and heavily damaged the store, which never reopened, and damaged a couple of other buildings around there. In fact, the old Sumter County Courthouse, the clock on the courthouse, the clock face was damaged by it. There was a gouge in the sidewalk. It was a very big bomb. After that, the city fathers of Americus kind of put out the word that they didn't want any more Klan coming around bombing people on Main Street. Innocent people might get killed. You know, it was one thing to go out and do it in the country at the farm. They didn't care too much about that. But if you're going to set off a bomb on Main Street, you know, our sons and daughters might get hurt. And so they kind of called an end to all that and actually tried to buy out Koinonia. They tried to get Koinonia to sell its property and move somewhere else where they wouldn't be so controversial. So the drive-by shootings and freelance explosives pretty much stopped, but the boycott continued for years. And it's interesting to note that the violence had the effect of making Koinonia, it drove away the black people. At the time the violence started, there were about 60 people living at Koinonia, and about 15 of them were black. And the first people who left when the violence started were the black folks. And Koinonia encouraged them to leave because everybody thought if they're driving by the farm shooting at folks, who are they going to shoot at first? We need to get you someplace where you're safer. So after the violence, Koinonia ironically became pretty much an all-white community because of the threat of what was happening there. At this point, we're up to about 1969, at this point, the conflict between Koinonia and Sumter County moved into the public schools. In the fall of 1960, 3 of the farm's children, including Greg's older brother Billy, were ready to start high school at the same time. They wanted to go to Americus High School because it was considered the best school in the county, but it was a city school, and they lived out in the country. Now, the city school system pretty much routinely would allow anybody from out in the county to come in and go to Americus High School, but in this case, they declined. They said that if these people came to our school, that there would be disruptions and it would just screw everything up. And the Koinonia parents had to go to federal, they literally had to make a federal case out of it. They went to federal court in Macon and got a court order ordering their children into the school. The judge said it was religious discrimination, pure and simple. You can't tell them not to come in there. So they went there, and oddly enough, the school board was right. It was a disruption. People harassed them daily. They were shunned and called names, occasionally spit at. For them, going to classes became sort of a daily running of the gauntlet. Greg was a year younger. He came to high school, joined this unhappy scene in the fall of '61. He was a 14-year-old ninth grader, and it was a very inauspicious time for a known integrationist to be starting at an all-white school in Sumter County because, by coincidence, that was the autumn that the Civil Rights Movement mobilized in Albany. That November, mass demonstrations on a scale never seen before in a southern city began here. A full frontal attack on segregation, similar to the one that would become more famous in Birmingham a couple of years later. It became a war of attrition, as you know very well. Hundreds of protesters were arrested and locked up in Albany, and a great many of them were taken to jails in surrounding counties. Some of the detainees were sent to Americus. One of them was Martin Luther King Jr. He was taken to the Sumter County Jail in Americus and was treated so rudely by the sheriff there, Fred Chappell, that when King got out, he told a reporter from Jet magazine that he had just met, quote, the meanest man in the world. Koinonia was involved in the movement from the beginning. Civil rights organizers knew that the farm community believed in what they believed in, and had suffered from the kind of violence and resistance they had met with and could expect to meet more of. When the mass meetings started at the churches on this street, a lot of people from Koinonia did come and attend them. Greg went to one where Clarence Jordan was asked to speak. He was one of the few white men who was invited to do so. He told some folksy story about two hunters out trying to catch a bear, and one of them lured the bear. The bear chased him into a cabin, and then the guy went running out on the other side and said, "You skin him now, I got him for you." And his point was, I just want you to know, people here in Albany, that Koinonia is with you. We're not going to run out of the cabin. We're going to help you skin the bear. Now, despite Koinonia's support for the movement, Jordan and some of the other adults there did not agree with all of the movement's tactics. Clarence opposed boycotts, for instance. He did not regard boycotts as an act of nonviolence. Koinonia had been boycotted for years. He regarded it as a very coercive act, and he did not agree with that as a tactic. But he certainly agreed with the end goals of the movement. For months, while the mass meetings were going on here in late '61 and all through '62, young people from Koinonia, including my main character, Greg, would come down and go to the mass meetings. It left a real deep impression on them. This is not actually in the book, but I want to read a brief description here from one of the young people at Koinonia that Deanie knew. She was in the class ahead of them, Laura Brown. Laura lives down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida now. She's just a delightful person, but she kept a journal through all of this. And she had this is her description of coming to a meeting in Albany, and I think it's 1962, because she's talking about the heat. I think it's a summer of '62 meeting. She says, "Daddy, Jan Jordan, Clarence and I went to the Sunday afternoon voter registration meeting. We were the only whites in the church, a wooden structure with large windows and a multitude of hand fans. It was quite hot, and the church was packed overflowing. Heads were sticking in the open windows, and outside there was quite a crowd which was there to hear Dr. King speak. It seemed to take a long time for things to get ready, and people walked in and out of the church, and there were a lot of women dressed in white dresses and shoes, all fanning themselves gently or furiously, depending on the time. At last the organ began, and people began to sing, and finally Dr. King was introduced. He started to talk amid long applause, talked about the Bible, about voter registration, about standing up and making a statement, about how important it was to be nonviolent. And then the crowd began to respond. At first only a few said amen, and then more and more joined in until it seemed like the entire room was filled with Dr. King and responses of amen, and you tell it like you tell it to him, brother, and yes, 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 and say it again, brother, and all that stuff. I was astonished. I had never been to a service before in which the congregation responded to the minister as he was talking. I remember being shocked and a little embarrassed, and yet realizing as the afternoon wore on that this wasn't unusual. The people around me were comfortable doing this. When Dr. King sat down, he was covered with sweat, but still wearing his suit jacket. And in the congregation, there were people crying, people who had been so moved by the Spirit. There was a unity and an excitement and a hope that hadn't been there before the meeting. The crowd finally stood, and with Dr. King leading and Dr. Abernathy by his side, a number of young men started singing, "We Shall Overcome." Everybody held hands, it swayed to the music, and it went on as verse after verse unfolded and sung. And the singing filled the rafters, and the roof seemed to raise and then lower back on the structure. And it was seriously and meaningfully sung. And then the meeting was over. And we were all having our hands shook from everyone on all sides. It was wonderful. What a moving feeling. For the first time, we were in a community of people who felt the way we did. It was a heady experience for me, never having been to a meeting like this. The civil rights workers, Charles Jones and Charles Sherrod, were romantic figures to me. They stalked by danger. They were in the forefront of a glorious movement which would bring equality for all. We left and went back to Koinonia, and I remember being excited and happy and scared and feeling very important because I was one of the first white people in the South to have supported something which was inevitable. The Albany movement, of course, was envisioned as a beachhead by the principal group that was driving things here, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And in early 1963, SNCC sent a couple of organizers to Americus. They were going to fan out the movement, and Americus was the nearest. Americus and Cordele, I think, are the two nearest towns of any substance. And Americus was the first place they went because it was known that there was a large number of black young people there who were just spoiling to do something. So they sent a couple of organizers up there. One of the first places when they came to Sumter County they visited was Koinonia. Over the next few years, the farm became a familiar stopover for civil rights workers. Koinonia welcomed them for picnics and rest and relaxation. SNCC held orientation sessions on the farm, teaching recruits about nonviolent resistance. In the summer of 1963, the movement finally swung into action in Americus as scores of demonstrators, most of them teenagers, protested segregation at the movie theater and other places. The police retaliated with brutality, mass arrests, not as many as in Albany, but a lot of arrests. You all know about the Leesburg Stockade, I'm sure. We were just walking through looking at some of Danny Lyon's pictures out there. A lot of white folks who grew up in that time did not know what was going on in their town. They didn't know all of it. Deanie only recently learned about the Leesburg Stockade. These, of course, were the young women who were arrested during the protests in the summer of '63 and taken to this antiquated stockade in Lee County. And some of them held almost incommunicado for several weeks and under primitive conditions. There was another group of activists who were arrested in Americus and charged with fomenting insurrection, an antiquated charge in Georgia that carried the threat of the death penalty. That fall of '63, Greg was a junior at Americus High School. His classmates didn't know much about the civil rights movement. Most of what they knew came through their parents, who were by and large very much against it. Even if they thought black people had been given a bad hand, they didn't like the protests, they didn't like the people being arrested, they didn't like the unrest that was happening in their town, so they were pretty much against it. And Greg's classmates knew very well that Koinonia was aligned with the movement. As far as they were concerned, it was kind of an enemy camp in their backyard. And Greg, coming from Koinonia, was considered kind of a traitor in their midst. Greg was harassed and hectored his entire time at Americus High, but it grew worse as the Civil Rights Revolution got closer to home and attitudes hardened. There's one day in the fall of '63 that kind of vividly demonstrates this. It's a day everybody remembers, November 22nd, 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. I was a third grader at Knollwood Elementary School in DeKalb County when the principal came over the intercom early that afternoon and told us that the president had been shot. And most of us didn't understand what was happening, but the ones who did were very upset, and there were people crying. At Americus High School, in at least one classroom, the reaction was different, and it was all colored by civil rights. Greg's younger brother David, in his classroom, when the principal announced that Kennedy had been shot, there were several young men who cheered and were happy. All they knew about the President of the United States was that he was in favor of civil rights, and that threatened to upend the Southern way of life. Now, I know that most of the people at Americus High School didn't feel that way. I know that most of them were shocked by that. I'm sure Deanie was. But for David and Greg and some of the other people in their classes, they vividly remember that there were people who were so upset by Kennedy and his stand on civil rights that that's the way they viewed a president being killed. So that brings us to Greg's senior year. One by one, the other students from Koinonia who had gone to Americus High School left the school. Their families either moved away or they transferred to schools outside the South where they wouldn't be subject to the same level of persecution. By the fall of '64, Greg was the only Koinonia kid left at Americus High School. And it was the worst possible time to be the only Koinonia kid at Americus High School. It was bad because that summer, Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And a lot of white people were in a testy mood because for the first time in anybody's memory, black people were walking into restaurants and expecting to be served like any other human beings. And, you know, I'm sure a lot of white people in America thought that was curious and had no big problem with it, but there was a substantial number of people who were very upset about it. So feelings were kind of rubbed raw. There had been several incidents, fights at diners and things like that. And the situation was even more fraught in Americus because late that summer, the city school board, the same people who had turned away the Koinonia students 4 years before, they decided more or less in secret to admit a handful of black students to the high school. They hoped that token integration would diffuse the racial tensions that had just roiled their town over the last 2 or 3 years and head off any more substantial mixing of the races that the federal government was likely to insist on sometime soon. Well, if they thought that was going to head off trouble, the ploy didn't work. At the beginning of school that year, Greg phoned some of his black friends, people that he had known because he had been active in the protests. He was actually closer to a lot of them than he was to his white classmates who wouldn't give him the time of day. He called up these 4 students who were planning to desegregate the high school and found out that they were planning on going to school in the black funeral home limousine, the Barnum Funeral Home limousine, and all go together. And he asked if he could go with them to show his support and solidarity with them. So the limousine arrives at the back entrance to Americus High School. There's a small mob of people there to greet them. Most people think there were 50 to 75 people there. They're not really parents of students as much as townspeople who are really irritated about this high school desegregating. And, you know, the limousine is met with rocks and bottles and lots of ugly words being screamed. The same kind of stuff that we saw at Little Rock and at Ole Miss and at the University of Georgia in Athens when it was desegregating with Charlene Hunter Galt. The limousine pulls to a stop in front of the scowling sheriff. A door flies open, and who pops out? But not one of the black students, but this white kid from Koinonia. Greg's the first person who gets out of the car. Not surprisingly, things didn't go well for him the rest of that year. In school, they popped him with paper clips, they called him names, they peed in his locker, trashed his book, all the usual stuff that had been happening on and off again for the whole time he had been there. But for the first time in the fall of '64, he was directly assaulted. He was struck twice that fall by boys, once so hard that he felt pain in his jaw for weeks. There was another time he was hit in the cafeteria by a flying Sloppy Joe. There was another time where one of his white classmates accused him of calling him an ugly word and challenged him to a fight after school, and it kind of festered for a couple of days, and Greg was leaving classes at the end of the school day one year, walking by this really neat old baseball grandstand that Americus High School has, and a group of anywhere from 30 to 50 boys stepped out and surrounded him. And the guy who felt aggrieved, who felt that he had called him a name, came up to him, challenged him to a fight. Greg, who was very schooled in nonviolence and also was very practical and knew if he got into a fight that 50 boys would beat up one boy no matter how strong he might be. Greg told him he wasn't going to fight. And this guy hauled off and hit him, just hit him with a haymaker. And Greg really was staggered. And then he did something that's straight out of the Bible. He stuck his chin out to this guy, left his arms down by his side, and said, the guy's name was Thomas. He said, "Thomas, I love you." And it really disarmed the situation. I mean, you can hit a guy once, but if a guy sits there and says, "I love you," it'd be really weird to hit him again. And it's funny to me in doing this, but a lot of the girls, like Deanie, who were in his class, really didn't even know about a lot of this stuff that was happening. It was the boys who were doing it to him, and it was actually even a minority of the boys who were doing it to him. And it wasn't something that they went and bragged about to their girlfriends or to their mothers. I was very struck that in many cases, the things that Greg went through in high school, a lot of Deanie's female classmates were finding out things in the last 5 years that they had never known about. So the abuse continued. It kind of slacked off toward the tail end of his senior year. And then at his graduation 50 years ago, I guess it's coming up here in another 10 days. What was it, June 7th, I think, 1965, a Monday night. It was almost like the beginning of school all over again. Greg, a lot of people booed when his name was called to get his diploma. He came to the ceremony with his closest friend at the time, who was a black man, young, 2 or 3 years older than Greg, who worked at the farm, named Collins McGee. Really interesting, colorful figure. Collins and Greg were leaving the gymnasium after the ceremony, and there were a group of about 15 or 20 men who menaced them and started chasing them and threw things at them, and one of them came up and hit Collins over the head with an umbrella. It was like he was, you know, how many of us have graduated from high school and been chased out by people who were throwing things at us? But there was a grace note at the graduation that promised better things to come. One of Greg's classmates, a fellow who's a banker in Perry, Georgia now, named David Morgan, who I had lunch with earlier today. David had actually become increasingly troubled by the way people were treating Greg and had said a couple of things to other people. And at the when they were getting ready to go get their diplomas, he actually came up to Greg and shook his hand in front of everybody and said, "I don't know how you made it." And you know, to David, this did not have great resonance through the years. He was just doing something that was decent. To Greg, it was everything in the world. It was by far the nicest thing any of his classmates had ever done to him at America's High School. It was like something that he could put his arms around and feel better about humanity. And as luck would have it, years later, 40 years later, when they were planning their 40th reunion, David Morgan was the person who was planning the reunion. Greg had left Americus after high school, eventually settled in West Virginia. Oddly enough, there were several Koinonia children who grew up down here during that period who all live within a few miles of each other in southern West Virginia. And they're all kind of they all kind of went up there in the 70s due to kind of Mother Earth News hippie lifestyle. And David mentioned to several of his other classmates who he thought probably would feel like he did about what happened to Greg and about what happened those days. And one of the first people he talked to about it was Deanie, who's here tonight. And they all got to talking and they agreed that it was time to reconcile with Greg, that everybody had grown up, that things had changed, and that they all felt regretful that they had not done anything to comfort him in those years. And so in the spring of 2006, Greg's up there in West Virginia. He goes to get his mail one day. This is actually the way the book opens. And he finds an invitation to his class reunion. And he was just like, what the hell is this? How'd they know how to find me? I've forgotten about all that. And then that first day, there's a letter from David Morgan. And it's a really beautiful letter. I'm just going to read the very beginning of it. Dear Greg, I expect you will be quite surprised to hear from me. If you remember me at all, it will likely be for unpleasant reasons. I was a classmate of yours at America's High School and graduated with you in 1965. I don't recall ever directly assaulting you, but I probably did, to gain the acceptance and accolades of my peers. In any case, I surely participated as part of an enabling audience and tacitly supported and encouraged those who did. For that, I am deeply sorry and regretful. Throughout the last 40-plus years, I have occasionally thought of you in those dark days that you endured at our hands. As I matured, I became more and more ashamed and wished that I had taken a different stand back then. I knew even then that it was all wrong, yet I did nothing to stop it or even to discourage it. Over the next few days, Greg got about 10 letters from classmates, got some phone calls. Several of the letters were equally eloquent. One of the most heartfelt ones came from Deanie. Deanie wrote, quote, "I will never say again, how could the Holocaust have happened? How could all those Christian people in Poland and Germany have stood by and allowed it to happen? I was present with you over a long period of time, and I never once did one thing to comfort you or reach out to you. It was cruelty." I've since gotten to know Deanie a lot better, and I know what a sensitive soul she was, this bothered her. She's the kind of person who would be bothered by this kind of thing. I think it takes a lot of moral courage to admit something like that and then to act on it. We all have things in our past that we regret, and most of us never do anything about it or wouldn't know what to say. And these people did do something about it, and they found words, and I really admire them for it. So a lot of this book, particularly the second half of it, is about what happened in the intervening years to change the outlooks of Greg's classmates. I mean, these were good, the people who reached out to him, these were good church-going young people for the most part, but they had grown up in a system that had held sway in the South for many decades. They were the children of segregation, the white children of segregation. The side of it you don't hear that much about. And they had a lot of learning and unlearning to do. Now, I'm going to take a few questions, but before I get to that, I want to address one other thing. I'd like to talk a little bit about the students who desegregated America's high school in 1964. There were 4 of them: Jewel Wise, David Bell, Dobbs Wiggins, and Robertina Freeman. They were mistreated awfully, and only one of them stayed at the high school through to graduation, Robertina, who now goes by her married name, Tina Fletcher. When Greg and I did a book talk in Americus last month, shortly after the publication of the book, I'm proud to say that all 4 of those students who desegregated the high school came to the talk. There's a lot in the book about the 4, especially Robertina, whose story threads through the last half of the narrative. Believe me, I could have written a book about her, and I'm happy to report that she wants to do a book. She's retired now and has time to pay attention to it, and she's got a really good story to tell. But this book, even though it touches on a lot of it, it isn't her story. One of the best things that's been written about the class of '65 was a review in the Washington Post by Donna Britt. It's a well-known columnist who happens to be black. Donna considered this question of black heroes and white heroes a question that caused me a lot of agony. And let me read you what she concluded. She said, "This is a great story, ably reported by former Atlanta Journal-Constitution journalist Jim Auchmutey, and told with humor and grace. Yet, as a black person, I wondered, was this another white savior narrative? Think of the movies Mississippi Burning and The Help, celebrating a white person's bravery for supporting beleaguered blacks while de-emphasizing the African Americans who required courage just to survive. Whitcamper was horribly mistreated, but so were his black schoolmates. Of the 4, only Robertina Freeman stayed at the school to the end. Surely a girl who wasn't cowed by withering rejection, all for the pigmentation she couldn't change, deserved acknowledgement as much as a boy persecuted for not joining her tormentors. But the more I learned about Whitcamper's grit, the more I admired him. Courage deserves acknowledgement, no matter what color it's wrapped in. My predominant why became, why can't the rest of us be as brave?" I was very grateful to Dinah Britt for raising that question, which I knew would get raised. And I'm glad she found this a worthwhile story, even if it wasn't in her heart of hearts necessarily the story she wanted to read. Well, thank you very much. I would be happy to take any questions about the book, about Koinonia, about its connection to the civil rights movement, about the backstory of the book, anything you'd be interested in asking me about. I'm your humble servant. Thank you.
What is it that we got to keep us separated, and why?
Man, there's a lot of baggage, you know that, and there's a lot. I mean, these things don't change overnight, and it was so. The caste system in this country, and particularly in the South, was so dark and so pronounced for so long that it's just not something you overcome in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. It takes a long time. And I can't give you a good answer to that because it's senseless, really. You try to explain it, but at root it's senseless. You can come up with historical reasons for it, but it just doesn't, there's no justification for it. I thought a lot when I was writing this book about my own experience. I'm 8 years younger than the class of '65, and I grew up in suburban Atlanta. I was class of '73 at Avondale High School in DeKalb County. But you know, those 8 years difference between what they went through and what I went through are absolutely, I mean, at the time they started school, it was unthinkable that there would be black students at their high school. At the time I started school, it was only a question of how many and how's it going to happen and how soon is the federal court order going to be enforced. As it turned out, it was enforced during my 9th grade year. There were a very small number of blacks at Avondale High School when I started, and then of course they did what they almost always did. They closed the black high school and divvied up its students among the surrounding white schools. So overnight we got 200 black students. And that was the first time in my life I had meaningful discussions with people of my age of a different race, to tell you the truth. The irony of this is, even though, I mean, you know, I think somebody like Deanie growing up in America's probably, even growing up in segregation, probably had more meaningful contact with black people than I did in suburban Atlanta. I guess I'm saying all of this because I was trying very hard in writing this book to understand what it looked like to everybody, all the parties involved in it. Even if looking back 50 years later, I don't think that some of the things they believed in and some of their attitudes were, I thought they were pretty awful. I haven't answered your question very well, but it's kind of the American question, and there's not an easy answer. Yes, ma'am. My first job out of college was with the Presbyterian Churches magazine in Atlanta. It was, talk about stupid, when I started there was, you know, the northern branch and the southern branch were still split. In 1978, many decades after the Civil War, they were still split. They had split over slavery in 1861 and they still hadn't reunited. So I worked for the Southern Branches magazine. And one of the people who was writing for us told me all about Koinonia. I'd never heard of it. And she wanted to do a story for me about Koinonia, and I let her do it. And when I started at the Journal-Constitution in 1980, literally the first out-of-town assignment I ever did was to come down to Americus and visit Koinonia in the fall of 1980. It's about 2 weeks before Carter lost his re-election bid to Reagan. I came to Americus a lot over the years. So I knew the Koinonia story. And I knew its connection to Habitat. I did some early stories on Millard Fuller and Habitat. I remember picking him up at the Atlanta airport one time for a profile I did for a magazine that's no longer with us called Southern Magazine. And Millard was such a multitasker and a busy guy. He said, I got to get from the Atlanta airport back to Americus. Why don't you pick me up and we can talk on the way? So I'm driving him back down US 19 with him holding a tape recorder and me driving and him just, expounding and everything. So I knew a lot of this story, the backdrop of it, but I didn't know the exact story of what happened when the Koinonia kids went to schools. And I certainly didn't know the story of this reunion. And I was tipped off about it because a former editor of mine who had gone on to become managing editor of the paper in Greensboro, North Carolina, she grew up in Roanoke, Virginia, and was friends with the family that Greg's wife, Ann Gardner. She knew her. And she was at a dinner party shortly after this reunion in 2006. And she called me up and told me, Jim, I just heard the most wonderful story about this reunion and about what all these kids went through in high school and everything. And it just sounded like the perfect story for you because I know how much you love these sort of deeply Southern, difficult, but profound stories. And so she tipped me off about it, and I got in touch with Greg, and I didn't go to the reunion. It had already happened by the time I found out about it, but I had the second best thing. Faith Fuller, Millard Fuller, the Habitat co-founder, Faith Fuller, his daughter, she's a documentary filmmaker. And she had known Greg and the Whitcamper family all her life from Koinonia. And she went to all the reunion events that weekend in June of 2006 and taped them. And when she heard I wanted to work on this story, she just dubbed me a copy of everything she had. So I had hours and hours of records of everything that was happening. And I wish I had been there, but in some ways this was almost better. It was like having a living transcript. And so that's how I found out about this story. And it's obviously because of my interest in Koinonia and my having worked on a church publication, my being a fifth-generation Georgian, this story had a lot of resonance for me.
I'd like to say that since you are been affiliated with the media for 30 years or whatever, would you think, how do you feel about media's influence on race relations? From my perspective, the media can be one of the most divisive things in society that keeps people divided because of their journalism, sensational journalism.
I actually agree with you. When I was having lunch earlier today with David Morgan, a key figure in this book, we were talking about that some. We were talking about in connection with the violence in Baltimore. When the looting and the burning and all started after the person was killed in Baltimore, that's dramatic footage, and it was given very big play on all the cable news networks and all the media. And it would be interesting to know whether what happened the following day got the same sort of play. What happened the following day was all the people who lived in those neighborhoods who really did not want their places being burned, who had actually worked to get that CVS store built there because it was a big step forward for that neighborhood to have a place like that. They didn't like a bit what had happened. They were out there the next day telling anyone who would listen, that this isn't what we want. This isn't what we're about. And they were out there picking up the pieces, literally and figuratively. And, that was covered some. It might not have been given the same promise, but it was covered some. But the emotional way to watching a building getting torched and watching a middle-aged woman talk about how we don't want violence in this community, which one's more memorable? It's the building getting torched. It's human nature. You remember that more. I think there has been a lot of sensationalism, and I think the media is sometimes a problem, a contributing problem on all of this, like it is on almost any story. You have to really work hard to get things in the proper context and not sensationalize things. Some people do a good job of that, but obviously a lot of people don't too. And people, when they think back about what happened in Baltimore, they remember that drugstore burning. They don't remember the people in the streets the next morning saying that's not what we're about. Some people do remember that, but a lot of people only remember the dramatic image, and I hate that.
Are those events in the South in places like Albany and Americus?
Well, we've had 2 or 3 incidents very much like that in Atlanta, in metro Atlanta. They haven't, I would like to think that people in Atlanta talk enough that things don't usually erupt into some sort of mass violence because something happened that's unjustified and upsets a lot of people. But we've certainly had incidents like that happen in Atlanta, and they happen everywhere. I get dismayed when I hear people get frustrated over some of these cases with the police and some of the violent response to it and the protests and all that. I get dismayed when I hear people say, "Oh man, it's just like 1960 again, nothing's changed." And of course that's totally wrong. A lot's changed. A lot of things have changed for the better. You could even say the glass is, I don't know, 3/4 full, but it's still 1/4 empty. And that 1/4 empty can be really ugly. Every year there's another issue. This year, the last couple of years, it's been police incidents. But there's always some issue that comes up that reminds us that as much as we would like to think that all the racial stuff has been worked out, and a lot of white people like to think, well, the laws have changed and we've worked all that out and we can move on now, and we've got a black president. I mean, all that's taken care of. And of course that's not true. I mean, there's a lot of residual stuff from 2 centuries more of American history that still needs to be worked out. And we obviously know that one of the things that needs to be worked out is the relationship between police and the communities that they're supposed to be protecting. And it can get really, really complicated. I mean, I'm still trying to get my head around the fact that, 6 officers have been indicted in Baltimore and 3 of them are black. That all has a huge racial dimension to it, but a lot of what happened in Baltimore, it seems to me too, is not, it's black and white, but a lot of it's actually blue and non-blue. It's about how cops see people, and sometimes justified because of the tough job they're asked to do and because they're in danger, but oftentimes just doing some really, bad snap judgments, profiling. Why do those things keep coming up? They keep coming up because we got things that we haven't dealt with. I hear people talk about how we need to have a national conversation on race. I always roll my eyes a little bit when I hear that, because I think we've been having a national conversation on race in a very fitful, not always productive, but I mean, we've been having a conversation on race since the 1960s. And every time anybody thinks it's something that we've already finished talking about, we've solved all that, you're reminded that it isn't. And that things keep coming up. There's just unfinished business, and we all know that.
And I think one of the things that you kind of alluded to that reminds me, I personally think one of the reasons we have a problem is because we still got this romantic interlude with the Civil War. We still caught up with celebrate every year. Why would we celebrate and romance something that was an eternal war between your fellow countrymen? It's just like me and my family had a big fight 10 years ago. Half of us got killed. And each year I romanticize about it. And I think about it, I celebrate, and I march up and down the road with flags. And I mean, it's crazy. That's what we do it. Each year, and sometime during the year, we had this romantic thing about the Civil War. It is done. It was not a good thing. There's nothing to be celebrated. So
actually, I disagree with you a little bit. The Civil War is very much to be celebrated. Not in the way you're talking about,
not
but
the romantic way that we celebrate in the sense that
a lot of things changed because of the Civil War. No slavery, for instance. Yeah, I mean the Civil War. I hear what you're saying. I know what you're saying. There are a lot of people in the South who are very wrapped up in Civil War romance.
Exactly.
And you know, and I will admit to you, I mean, if you look at my bookshelves at home, you'll see that I've got a ton of books on the Civil Rights Movement and a ton of books on the Civil War. I love both of them as things to study in history, but I also, unlike some people I think don't realize that those are, it's the alpha and omega of the same battle, you know? A lot of people don't really get that. And when it comes to the Civil War, I personally have tried, I like to study the politics of it, but I am very interested in all the military, all the battlefield stuff too. But boy, it's hard to get real enthusiastic about a Confederate general when you know what he was fighting for, ultimately. And you know, and I didn't used to think that when I was a boy. I mean, I was a boy running around, you know, with a rifle and doing all that reenacting stuff when you know, the Civil War Centennial was happening when I was 7 and 8 years old. And all I knew about it back then was that an invading army had burned my hometown in Atlanta, and I wanted to know why that happened. And then later on I found out why it happened and knew that there was something a lot bigger going on. Yes, ma'am.
I want to know, how do we get to the future, the now? We have young people. I mean, it's good to talk about the context of the past, but we have a currency right now. And how do we, what would you leave us with to get us to a convergence of how do we get over the structural history that has in fact created the divide so that we can, as a people, a humanity, which is what the farm was about, this kind of communal, internal, external philosophy grounded in Christianity, and yet was caught up in the structural context of a society that we still have those structural divides in education, in employment, economic, and so for me, I want to know, how do we as a community of humanity get to a place where you would leave us with a commentary of, from that context of the review, how do we go to creating the positive direct action of improvement in the lives of people, especially because we have a country right now with a black president, with black HBCUs who are under almost constant now, almost, you know, just dissolution again in the context of beginning to where we are with our funding. There's just so many kind of structural things that it seems like we're not talking about the reality of the now, that we are living in a now that needs to be dealt with by direct consequence of action and movement rather than just kind of you understand what I'm trying to come to in the context of that? What would you leave us with for young people and for people who want to see the joy, the hope of what the foreign philosophy, you know?
Well, I think the most liberating thing that you can do is try to understand another person's point of view. What is it Atticus Finch says? You never really know a man until you get in his shoes and walk around. A lot of people go through life and never do that. I think the proper response to what happened in Baltimore, besides finding out who burned the store and making sure they're punished and things like that, I think the proper response, besides trying to reform the police procedures and all, the proper response is to try to understand why people would be so upset. What vein of deep anger here is this touching that we need to address? Because unless you do that, you're only dealing with cosmetic stuff. I think it all comes down to the most powerful thing is a mind that starts to broaden and starts to imagine what it's like for people who weren't from your background and your neighborhood. I mean, one of the things I really liked about all these people who reached out to Greg is that they all had different sort of broadening experiences in their lives, where they all had wonderful childhoods in America. So it was a wonderful place in their neighborhoods to grow up. But they all went out and saw some of the world and went to college, went into the military, had broadening experiences. And ultimately, that's the thing. All change is built on people broadening their minds, I think.
That leads me to the question that I was going to ask. In your research or interviews, are there members of that class who haven't come around yet that's still stuck in 65?
There are members of that class who, I wouldn't say they're stuck in 65 because they're obviously know things have changed and you can't do and say things that you did then. But yeah, there are definitely a handful of people in that class who I think were grumbling a little bit about the gestures toward Greg, and who wondered whether it was all necessary and didn't really feel like they had done anything so awful. I tiptoed around that in the book, to tell you the truth, because there were a couple of people in particular I would have liked to have spoken to who I knew other people had told me who had attitudes like that, and they didn't want to talk to me. And I didn't really want to name them because I didn't think it was fair to do that if I didn't have a chance to sit down and talk with them and try to understand where they were coming from. As a reporter, I've always just tried to understand people. I don't want to write about, even if somebody holds views that I think probably look pretty repugnant, I still want to understand why they hold those views. So I kind of tiptoed around that a little bit, but there, I think it's the minority of the class. I mean, when Greg went to that reunion, what David told me, David Morgan, was that there was probably about a third of the class that was wholeheartedly in favor of saying, "We're sorry, that never should have happened, please welcome back to the fold." Probably about a third in the middle, or maybe more, who were kind of, who said, yeah, that was bad, but weren't as motivated, but they were okay with it. And then there was probably a group, and it maybe not even a third of the class, maybe even as little as a tenth of the class, who just sort of were kind of like, what's that about? Nobody said anything ugly to Greg at the reunion. There were a couple of folks who grumbled a little bit, like I said, but nobody came up and said anything to him. 50 years ago, they would have done all sorts of things to him. So the way I look at it is that in the intervening time, they had sort of become the marginalized minority. Yes?
On the issue of broadening your view, as one of the stories that I want to hear from that time is the story of the really poor white people who were going through their own set of issues of just trying to make it, and how they went through that time, what that experience was like for them. And has this
You mean poor? You mean poor people?
Yeah, really poor white people.
Oh yeah.
Who were dealing with their own issues with the larger white community. The white people who lived on the other side of the track, and what the experience was like for them. And
I'm not sure what else I'm going to do that actually is directly about that, but I mean, what you're talking about is a pretty broad subject. I mean, most of the poor people in this country have always been white. There's always been a much greater percentage of African Americans who are poor than white, but in raw numbers, there have always been more white poor people. I mean, when Lyndon Johnson started the war on poverty, the first place he went was Appalachia, and he sat on that porch in eastern Kentucky, I think it was, with that family. And he did that Number one, because demographically it was a solid thing to do, but also, of course, it was a public relations thing to do. He didn't want all those white voters out there thinking that the war on poverty was just about black people. But you know, it's just hard to make any sort of blanket statements about poor black people or poor white people. I mean, there were always a range of, I mean, some of the poor folks in Sumter County, white folks, I'm sure were, some of them I know who were neighbors of Koinonia were very sympathetic to Koinonia. Some of the people who lived right around there, because they respected them as people, as farmers in their area who cared about them. Others, I'm sure, were some of those Klansmen who were shooting and bombing. They've always been a mixed bag, just like any other group that you can look at.
I want to thank you, Jim, so much for coming. Thank you for your questions. There is a table with books to purchase, and he will autograph the books for you. This will conclude our community nights until September. We're taking the summer off, but please stay tuned to your local media for an upcoming in September. I think you'll be very interested. Again, thank you for coming, and you are dismissed.